Imagine standing on the walls of a great European city in the 13th century. You are safe, you think. You are thousands of miles from the unknown lands of the East. You have stone walls, iron armor, and the certainty of your civilization. Then, you look at the horizon. It begins as a rumble, a low frequency in the earth that shakes the dust from the parapets. Then comes the cloud, a rolling wall of dust that blots out the sun. And finally, the sound, not of machinery, but of hooves. Tens of thousands of them. Out of the dust emerge warriors who look like they were born in the saddle. They move with a fluidity that defies logic, firing arrows with lethal precision while galloping at full speed. They do not fight like any army you have ever seen. They are faster than the wind, more organized than a colony of ants, and more ruthless than a plague. In the span of a single lifetime, these people, who started as a fractured collection of squabbling nomads living in felt tents, would trample the greatest empires of the medieval world into the mud. They would conquer more land in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. They would redraw the map of the globe, slaughter millions, and yet, paradoxically, create the first era of truly global commerce and communication. This is not a story of a kingdom that got lucky. It is the story of how a small, despised tribe of outcasts rose from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to conquer half the world. To understand how this happened, you have to understand where it began. The Mongolian steppe is a place where the geography itself is trying to kill you. It is a land of extremes, blistering summers, bone-shattering winters, and wind that never stops howling. For centuries, the tribes that lived here were trapped in a cycle of petty violence. They stole each other's horses, kidnapped each other's wives, and fought over grazing rights. They were irrelevant to the great powers of the South like the Jin dynasty of China, who looked at them as nothing more than barbarians to be managed, divided, and ignored. And they might have stayed that way forever had it not been for a boy named Temujin. His story doesn't start with prophecy or glory. It starts with disaster. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father, a minor chieftain, was poisoned by a rival tribe. The tribe, refusing to be led by a child, abandoned Temujin, his mother, and his siblings on the open steppe to die. They were left without livestock, without protection, and without hope. They survived by eating rats, marmots, and wild onions. It was a humiliating, desperate existence. At one point, Temujin was captured by former allies and locked in a wooden collar, treated like a dog. But it was in this crucible of starvation and betrayal that the man the world would come to fear was forged. He learned a simple, brutal lesson. Loyalty is everything, and mercy is a luxury the weak cannot afford. As he grew, Temujin began to attract followers. He didn't care about noble blood or lineage, which was a radical idea at the time. He cared about competence. If you were a talented general, he didn't care if you were a shepherd or a blacksmith. You led his armies. If you were a traitor, even if you were his own blood, you were finished. He slowly united the warring tribes, not just through charisma, but through a complete restructuring of society. He broke the old tribal loyalties and mixed men from different backgrounds into new units, creating an army loyal only to himself. By 1206, the impossible had happened. The tribes were one. At a massive gathering called a Kurultai, Temujin was given a new title. He was no longer just a chieftain. He was Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. But uniting the tribes was just the warm-up act. Genghis Khan looked south at the Jin dynasty of China, a civilization vastly superior in technology, population, and wealth. The Jin had millions of subjects. The Mongols had perhaps 100,000 warriors. On paper, it was a suicide mission. But the Mongols had something the world had never seen before: the ultimate war machine. The Mongol army was the most disciplined force in history. Every soldier had multiple horses, allowing the army to travel up to 100 miles a day, a speed that was essentially teleportation in the medieval world. Their weapon of choice, the composite bow, was a marvel of engineering. Made of horn, wood, and sinew, it had a draw weight of over 160 pounds and could pierce armor from hundreds of yards away. And they could fire it while riding at full gallop, hitting a target the size of a man's chest. When they hit the Jin dynasty, they didn't just use brute force, they used terror. Genghis Khan mastered the art of psychological warfare. If a city surrendered, he would often spare it, taking only tribute and engineers. If a city resisted, he would burn it to the ground and slaughter every living thing, men, women, children, even the cats and dogs. He wanted the reputation of the Mongols to arrive before the army did. He wanted his enemies to be paralyzed by fear before the first arrow was knocked. The campaign against China was brutal, but it was the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, roughly modern-day Iran and Central Asia, that showed the world exactly what it was dealing with. This conflict started over a mistake. Genghis Khan initially wanted trade, not war. He sent a caravan of merchants and ambassadors to the Khwarezmian governor of Otran. The governor, suspecting them of being spies, had them executed. Genghis Khan sent 3 more ambassadors to the Shah, demanding the governor be punished. The Shah, believing the Mongols to be filthy barbarians of no consequence, shaved the beards of 2 ambassadors and beheaded the 3rd. It was the single greatest mistake in the history of diplomacy. Genghis Khan didn't just declare war, he declared an apocalypse. He diverted his main force from China and marched west. What followed wasn't a conquest, it was an erasure. The Mongols swept through the Khwarezmian Empire like a scythe. Great cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of Islamic learning and culture, were reduced to ash. The irrigation systems that had supported life in the desert for centuries were destroyed. The rivers, it was said, ran red with blood. The Shah died on an island, alone and destitute, fleeing the phantom he had created. This campaign highlighted the Mongols' terrifying adaptability. They were nomads who'd never seen a stone fortress, yet they became the world's greatest siege engineers. They captured Chinese engineers and forced them to build trebuchets and catapults. They would dam rivers to flood cities. They would drive thousands of prisoners in front of their army as human shields, forcing defenders to kill their own people to get a shot at the Mongols. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But contrary to what usually happens when a charismatic warlord dies, the empire didn't collapse. It grew. His son, Ogedi, took up the mantle and pushed even further. This is where the story shifts from a regional conquest to a global threat. The Mongol armies, led by the brilliant general Subutai, turned their eyes toward Europe. Subutai is a name that deserves to be as famous as Napoleon or Alexander. He coordinated armies separated by hundreds of miles with the precision of a modern radio operator. In 1241, the Mongols invaded Europe. They crushed the Polish army and the Hungarian army within days of each other, despite the 2 battles being hundreds of miles apart. The European knights, heavy and slow in their iron armor, were helpless against the mobile Mongol cavalry. They were led into traps, surrounded, and annihilated. Europe was wide open. There was no army left to stop them from marching all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Pope was terrified. The kings of the West prepared for the end of the world. And then they vanished. Just as the Mongols were preparing to push into Vienna and Germany, a messenger arrived from the east. The great Khan Ogedi was dead. By Mongol law, the princes and generals had to return to Mongolia to elect a new leader. The entire army turned around and rode back into the sunrise. Europe was saved not by steel or strategy, but by a heart attack thousands of miles away. But the Mongols left more than just bones behind. This is the part of the story that often gets overlooked. Yes, they were destroyers, but they were also the architects of the modern world. Once the dust settled, the Mongols established what is known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For the first time in history, the Silk Road was under a single administration. You could travel from Rome to Beijing with a golden tablet of safe passage, and, as the saying went, a maiden could walk across the empire with a nugget of gold on her head and not be molested. They created the first international postal system, the YAM, a network of relay stations that allowed messages to travel across the continent in days. They didn't care what god you prayed to. While Europe was burning heretics, the Mongols allowed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists to debate freely in their courts. They moved knowledge as fast as they moved armies. Gunpowder, paper money, the compass, and the printing press flowed from China to the West, sparking the innovations that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. However, the empire was too vast to hold. It eventually fractured into 4 separate khanates, each assimilated into the cultures they had conquered. The Mongols in China became Chinese emperors. The Mongols in Persia became Muslim sultans. The ferocity of the steppe was diluted by the comforts of civilization. The legacy of this small tribe is etched into